Hello, my dear fashion friends. Welcome back to Redressing Fashion. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Beltrán-Rubio, and today I'm celebrating the start of the school year, which for many of us in English-speaking contexts happens around this time of the year. Unfortunately, it's looking like I won't be back to school this fall, and not exactly because I don't want to, but I did spend a good part of the summer thinking about fashion education and what I'd like to do differently this time around. I reflected on my experiences of previous years. I evaluated what has worked and what needs improvement. And I revisited my teaching philosophy statement, trying to reconnect with the activism of education. By the way, if you haven't listened to or haven't watched my review of Fashion Education, The Systemic Revolution, this is one of the books that has helped me go through this process of reevaluation. So if you're interested, please make sure to listen, watch, tune in when you can. I'm going to leave the link in the podcast notes. Beyond just a simple revision of the past academic year, for me, I think the rising uncertainty in academia and my academic future more personally has also meant that I've spent a lot of time revisiting my academic life, which has been going on for probably my entire life, but especially over the past decade when I started teaching in higher education. These reflections necessarily took me back to one of the most exciting talks that I've given probably in my academic career at Parsons a few months ago. Hazel Clark, a former professor of mine, a very good mentor, someone I really admire and appreciate, who is also professor of design studies and fashion studies at Parsons, asked me about my experience teaching fashion history and fashion studies in different parts of the world. I can't really remember the exact phrasing of her question anymore, but she inspired me to reflect on what it means to expand the usually Eurocentric stories we tell about fashion, and how I have moved through my desire and my mission to expand the canon of fashion as I've changed institutions, first in the United States, then in Colombia, and more recently in the United Kingdom. I've spent so much time pondering on this seemingly simple question that it inspired me to produce this entire episode, which is intended as a sort of back to fashion school celebration. More than a sort of continuation on my answer to Hazel after that talk, this podcast is meant to be a set of ideas on how to actually redress fashion education. Here, I share some of the practical strategies that students and educators of fashion at any level and in any kind of space can take as we enter this new academic year. But I also want to make this episode relevant to those of you who are not fashion students or educators, or who are not returning to fashion school this year, like potentially myself. You might hear brief snippets of fashion stories as I explain the ways of contributing to a more sustainable, ethical, and inclusive fashion system and expanding the fashion history canon so that it reflects the true diversity of global fashion, past and present. But this is not a history podcast, and this is probably also not a practical podcast, although there are some bits and pieces of both here and there. And while I have my own thoughts on the matter based on my ongoing reflections from this summer, I also invited some of my colleagues and friends to share ideas, because education and life more generally, I think, is better when we learn from others and when we collaborate with others. I couldn't be more thankful with everyone who replied to my random messages this morning, right before recording this episode. So thank you for your input, and also thank you for replying with such short notice. I know that I do need to do a better job at planning things out with more time. It's been a lifelong process. Someday I'll make it happen. It didn't happen today. Anyway, too much chatter. Let's dive into the actual topic of the podcast. One of the courses that I've been teaching the longest is fashion history, some sort of introductory survey that takes students through some of the most significant moments in fashion throughout history. Traditionally, this kind of course has been structured as a sort of timeline, with fashion originally starting at some point between the 15th and 18th centuries and focusing mostly on Euro North American developments in the 19th and 20th centuries, and maybe some pieces of contemporary fashion. That's exactly how I was taught the basics of fashion history in Colombia as an undergraduate student at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, and later as a graduate student in the MA in Fashion Studies at Parsons in New York. While this structure is pretty efficient when it comes to introducing students to the most commonly repeated stories of fashion, it also tends to leave way too many stories, practices, and perspectives behind, or I guess out of the story. When I returned to Universidad de los Andes 6 years after graduating and nearing the completion of my PhD researching Indigenous and Latin American fashion, I decided, and thankfully I was allowed to kind of take back that fashion history survey and design my own anti-history of fashion course. And that was actually the name of the course. Here, I dismantled the chronology and even Eurocentrism of fashion history, or at least that was my mission, and began by asking students to unpack the definitions of fashion and consider whether we need to redefine fashion to allow for more diversity. Instead of the chronology, we took a thematic approach that covered topics such as status, competition, gender identity, ethnicity, in the study of fashion history. And in every session, I made sure to bring examples and assign readings that covered different cultures, different geographic locations, and different time periods. I also asked students in their assignments to bring even more examples as case studies from around the world. But I know that it's not always easy to simply teach the courses you want. This is a situation that I've definitely encountered, especially more recently at my current institution, De Montfort University in Leicester, UK, where I have to teach a set of predefined courses, usually again around fashion history and other related topics, but I don't really get to design my own. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any strategies that we can use to redress the history of fashion and to expand the canon, even if it's in somewhat tangential ways sometimes. I'll share some of my strategies in a moment, but first I wanted to introduce the thoughts of Katie Ibsen, a fellow graduate from the MA in Fashion Studies at Parsons, who is now artifact manager at Illinois State University's historic fashion collection. This is what she told me.
The things that come to mind when I try to think about conversations that I've had with students that seem to actually have a little bit of a transformative impact were making the distinction between like capital F and little f. Maybe not like a distinction, but having a conversation between capital F and little f fashion. I find that so many incoming students into fashion programs or fashion related programs have a very narrow view of what fashion is, and that's to be expected. But when we encourage them to look at little f fashion, it shows them where all of the different like areas of fashion like are important and have meaning. And within that, something that I would really encourage students to think about is the role and history of a secondhand fashion. I think the secondhand fashion industry is growing at a really large rate. And I think that there are a lot of implications, therefore, that we both have to like understand and also will have to contend with as things like Shein and fast fashion enter the secondhand market. So I agree with the whole adopting thematic rather than chronological approaches. And the last thing that I often spend time talking with my students about is fashion history in your own wardrobe, in your own home. This is something I picked up from Jonathan because he spends like, a couple of weeks talking about fashion history, how it relates to you individually. So a piece from your wardrobe that is meaningful to you personally, or a piece from your wardrobe that somehow relates to fashion history more broadly thinking, or a piece in your wardrobe that kind of goes against these hegemonic ideas that we have about fashion history.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things, and maybe that's also one of the reasons why I, in the past, have started by redefining fashion and what we consider fashion. It's of course limited to a certain canon, to a certain idea that has been told to us and that we have repeated generation after generation. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other practices, perhaps more personal practices around self styling and around self expression, and maybe even how we buy and consume fashion, which is what Katie was saying, for example, about the secondhand market that couldn't enter, narrations of the history of fashion. These are actually great insights in that assignment about a personal piece of clothing that tells a story. I think is also a beautiful way of connecting fashion history with our more personal lived experiences. I don't think I have assigned something like this, although I would love to do that if I have the opportunity to implement this idea in a fashion history classroom soon. But one thing that I did maybe a couple of semesters with my students at Universidad de los Andes was asking them to write a love letter to one of their favorite design items. This was not just a fashion class, but a design history class. And the results were absolutely beautiful and absolutely touching. And I think it opened the way to discussing the everyday aspects and also the memory and the value, the personal value that we attach to certain objects in our lives, which points to bigger aspects related to design in this case, but I guess to fashion as well. Other things that I have done in the past include making sure to center the centuries long relationship between history of fashion and European colonialism and imperialism as much as I can. This is especially effective when I taught a traditional history of fashion survey following the chronology. And in the UK specifically, I've tried to center it as much as I can on the British Empire because it's definitely the most relevant in this context. But I've also managed to bring some cross-cultural or cross-colonial comparisons, as I call them, with the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese empires. And so in keeping these connections present, we can bring light into the colonial connections of some of the most widely cited phenomena in fashion and in fashion history, which include, for example, rubber, which is used in sneakers worldwide even today, cotton and printed cotton, which are associated with both the Indian subcontinent and enslaved labor, or bote motifs, which are of Persian origin, but are now associated and even named after the Scottish town of Paisley. And these are only three examples, but we can, of course, do much, much more with pretty much every single example from fashion history that we have. On a different course on fashion film cultures, I've taken a related but slightly different approach. This course is a sort of history of fashion image making, so it's not just about film, fashion film, or fashion in film, but it's more of a history of the representation of fashion from antiquity into the present day. And I rarely start with ancient Greek or ancient Roman sculptures as I was taught. Instead, what I do is that I share moche vessels, muisca golden figurines, and Mayan stele, all from the ancient Andes and Mesoamerica. And then eventually we get to Greece and Rome. When we reach oil painting, photography, and moving images, I try to use as much as I can the creations of Black and Indigenous creatives who portray racialized bodies. And throughout the process, we question the agency of artists, of patrons, of subjects and objects in the creation of the images. So I encourage students, and I actually ask them in class questions such as, Why was this image produced? What was the purpose? What was it meant to communicate about the people and the clothes portrayed? What are some of the underlying meanings and ideas that are being shared in the image? And maybe what are some of the stereotypes that the image perpetuates, questions, or sometimes even reclaims? I think questioning in general and encouraging students to problematize the stories we all know about fashion is my number one strategy when it comes to redressing fashion in the classroom. Asking students to stop and think about why we know certain stories but not others, why we take and accept some stories as true and sometimes even an absolute truth about fashion, and why we've contented ourselves with so many silences in fashion history is a way for me to also open spaces for these non-canonical histories to shine and to take up more space. I also like to think that this is probably where some of the students will be inspired to study them more in depth and maybe even specialize in non-Western or non-canonical histories of fashion and help me and all of the people who are working towards creating a more diverse history of fashion in the process. That's exactly what happened to me when I chose to focus on Latin American and indigenous fashion. I realized that there's so much that had been said about your North American fashion. It started to become a little boring. I realized there wasn't a lot of space for me to actually say something new. And there were, and in fact still are, way too many gaps in knowledge when it comes to other cultures and other parts of the world. So that's how I started researching Latin American fashion initially. Through Latin American fashion, I got into indigenous fashion, and that's basically what I've dedicated the last decade of my life to do. This also leads me to the issue of meeting students' interests. Dr. Serena Dyer, assistant professor of fashion history at De Montfort University, sent to me this message.
I think we really need to think about the psychology of what gets people interested in stuff and what gets them excited, because we can tell them a million times like these things are important, but they're not going to take that in unless they feel that excitement as well. You know, most of the time we end up reverting to really quite dull reasons that students should be excited, like it'll help your employability, or this is something that the industry is really like keen on right now. But would that work on you? Is that a reason to actually get into something? So I think we need to think more deeply about, well, what actually triggers that sense of excitement and importance and passion in us. And I don't necessarily have answers about how we do that, but I think it's always about connecting what we want students to get excited about back to things that they're already excited about, and finding those points of connection. I mean, we often do it in the way that we teach fashion history all the time, because what your students who maybe are really passionate about fashion, but at school, history was a massive turn off to them. So they're trying to make those connections. They're trying to find histories of stuff that they already really care about, that kind of way in. So I think it's kind of finding those avenues where they're already passionate about something. And how do we kind of switch that conversation up so that it's taking that existing passion and enlarging it to include these areas of fashion that really need more champions.
Yeah, and as a student, I think I remember the importance of feeling excited about what I was learning and maybe even feeling bored about the things that I was not really interested in. And I mentioned a while ago that when I realized that everyone and their mother was looking into European fashion, I was like, well, this is interesting, but then it also becomes boring at some point, because what is the novelty here? What am I learning that's actually new? And I think more importantly for me, and this is connected to my own personal values, what am I contributing? how am I making a difference, which I know is something that matters a lot to me. And when I realized where I could contribute, where I could make a difference, I remember it all clicked. And that's where I got really, really into fashion history. I think I was lucky that I had professors who noticed this passion of mine and supported me, and not just professors, but also mentors of different kinds throughout my life. And they've supported me and they've encouraged me. But if, as professors, we don't start by thinking or identifying the passions of students, then, as Serena just said, it's probably not easy to get them excited about other things. And yes, we all know that there are many things that we should do, or that people around us, in this case, she mentions the employers or potential employers, want from us. But if we're not excited about them, then maybe it won't be as easy to get interested in them or even to learn them. I do want to say that fashion history does tend to be exciting for a lot of people. What I sometimes see, though, is that when you challenge those big myths of fashion history that everyone has been repeating over and over again, or when you start speaking about people who are not the usual big names of fashion in the classroom, it is more difficult to get students involved. Although, on the other side, I've also noticed that, especially in my classrooms at De Montfort University, which tend to be kind of diverse, because I do have a lot of white British students, but I also tend to have students coming from different places or who are, more diverse British students. That include those with Indian heritage, with Islamic heritage, North African heritage, and African heritage more broadly, and a lot of Black British students as well. I've realized that when I share with them stories that are closely relevant to their own background and their own cultures, that's when they click. But they don't always click when we're just talking about the same old European white people that everyone has been talking about. So I guess it depends a little bit on the student body we have, but I do think that introducing a broader set, a broader array of people as well might help more students get interested and find their passions. The elephant in the room is, of course, artificial intelligence, though I must say that I hadn't even thought about including it in this episode until Dr. Jonathan Square, who is assistant professor of Black Visual Culture at Parsons, mentioned it. He texted me his ideas, so you're going to have to bear with me in trying to express his words. I unfortunately do not have the beautiful, deep voice that he has, but I'll do my best. He says, I've been thinking deeply about how to make my classes AI proof because I find ChatGPT written papers creatively and intellectually draining. To be clear, I'm not alluded. I use ChatGPT myself and recognize both its benefits and limitations. But my intellectual development occurred without such tools, and I believe students should first cultivate their own critical thinking before relying on AI. To that end, I've returned to old-fashioned methods of assessing students, pop quizzes, oral exams, and in-class writing assignments. I would add making discussions and assignments more personal, or that at least is what I have found to also work. Having read hundreds of essays over the last year, I couldn't agree more with Jonathan in that those created with generative AI are pretty dull. Though I thankfully don't think I received more than a dozen maybe of those. The most exciting ones, though, were those written by my second-year students in fashion communication and styling who were asked to write a statement in which they lay out their creative influences and analyze and demonstrate how through their work they engage with certain issues that matter to them. And they had to use examples of their own portfolio to explain how that was happening. So basically, like, visually analyze their own work. In reading the essays, I learned, for example, about one of the students' itinerant life, having been born in the Indian subcontinent and then moving around until she finally arrived in the UK for, I think, secondary school at some point. And throughout the process of her questioning her own identity and I guess connecting with some very specific cultural influences, I also witnessed her embrace elements from both cultures more boldly in her creative practices. So this influenced not just her writing, but also her creative expression, her more practical, so to speak, image making side of her career and studies. Another student wrote about her recent move to the UK from the US and the influence of contemporary feminist artists in her work. And yet another one wrote about her family's business in hospitality and added a transcultural layer to the common trope that brings fashion and food together in advertisement. So if you ask me, the personal nature of this assignment made it more difficult for students to rely on AI and definitely more pleasurable for me to read and evaluate. Beyond fashion history, some of the people that I reached out to also had thoughts about fashion in the classroom, as in what we wear when we teach and learn about fashion. Katie Ibsen from Parsons and Illinois State University, for example, said to me,
Speaking of the clothes that we already have in our wardrobes, something that has often encouraged the little light bulb to go off in students' minds is to have them talk about their wardrobes in relation to what we are talking about in class. So I find that it just makes things a lot more relatable to students when we actively have something, some material object that they have interacted with repeatedly over, in their experience, something that's really close and intimate to them, makes the kind of theoretical things that we talk about in fashion theory and then the distance when it comes to history much more grounded. So I really encourage students to look at their own wardrobes critically. If we're talking a little bit more like encouraging and giving students tips to like succeed in school and things like that when it comes to fashion, I want to encourage students to not stress about their own outfits. I mean, I think we all think a lot about the way that we get dressed, but you don't necessarily have to look a certain way in order to be really engaged in fashion history and fashion theory. And in fact, I think that sometimes being in a fashion program or taking fashion classes sometimes puts a lot of pressure on people. This was something I experienced a little bit more so at Parsons, like the pressure to be fashionable and find that that's what students focus on rather than focusing on like the critical analysis. So just to like relax a little bit, and personal style is something that you will continue to develop over time, and that the classes that you're taking about fashion history and fashion theory will have an impact on the way that you dress, and to just like let that unfold. And I think you probably know a thing or two about this with your personal styling coaching.
I love that Katie actually mentions my personal style coaching here, because I did want to make a joke at the beginning of this podcast episode saying that this is about back to fashion school and not back to school fashion. And then I decided to just leave it out. But yeah, what she's saying is true. What we study also influences how we dress. And there's a lot that we can say about that. And then also where we study can also create extra pressures maybe on some of us to think that we have to play the part or look the part, I guess. I've definitely also navigated this personally. I do remember having a big shock when I arrived to Parsons and realized or thought that I didn't really belong there because of how I dressed. But then with life and as things have happened, I've learned to develop my own personal style in this. I think I have a pretty solid personal style now, but it's of course the result of a years long process. It is also though the result of questioning a lot of what I wear and why I wear what I wear, and connecting it with many of my own insights as a fashion scholar and as a fashion educator and researcher and historian. And actually, that is, in fact, the framework that I developed for my personal style coaching program. I bring together values, identity, lifestyle to design a sort of style portfolio that can endure for a lifetime, that will evolve with us as we change and grow and evolve in life, but that the basics are in a way so closely linked to our values that they don't necessarily change all that much with time. I am offering a group version of this style program starting next week, first week of September. There's still time to join if everyone's interested. And I might actually, at some point, create some sort of podcast about it. But that's definitely not the topic of today. I do want to echo Katie's words in that developing a style, a personal style, is a lifelong process. And many times when we're studying, we want to have it all solved, all put together. And well, that's not necessarily always going to happen. And I do find in a lot of people, my fashion students, my clients that I am a style coach for, my friends, my family, and even myself, that as we learn more about the history of fashion, and especially as we learn about some of the problematic dynamics that exist in fashion, we sometimes want to take action to revert them with how we dress, or to question them with how we dress, or maybe support the causes, the people, the ideas that matter to us with how we dress. And that's actually one of the reasons why over the years I started dressing almost exclusively with Latin American fashion brands and indigenous fashion brands. When I moved to the UK and I started meeting and seeing and being aware of more and more Black British creatives, I've also started to buy some of my clothes from them. And that's because these stories matter to me, and I would rather put my money in these people, return some of what I earn to them, rather than just dumping it to brands whose values I don't align with. But that, of course, is my very own personal way of engaging with things. There's another issue that has to do, I guess, with shopping, so not entirely separate from this, that actually Kimberly Jenkins, the founder of Artist Element Consulting and principal researcher at the Fashion and Race Database, mentioned to me when I asked her for her input for this podcast. Let me show you what she said.
Something I recently saw on social media, I think it was on NYU's social media account. They have a thrift shop of sorts on campus where students can come in and shop for all of the discarded or left behind appliances and furniture from previous students. I thought that was such a brilliant idea. And while that's not clothing, I think that clothing swaps or pop-up secondhand shops where students are able to share clothing would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, and I actually think this is a brilliant idea to facilitate those spaces in classrooms. I'm actually remembering one of the first classes that I took at Parsons. It was called Fashion Practices, and it was all about questioning why we wear what we wear and kind of linking it with bigger dynamics in the fashion industry. And one of the things that we did in that class was a clothing swap. And it was beautiful, not just because of the swap, but we also had to tell the story of the garment that we were bringing to the swap to kind of explain its value to the people who were potentially taking it. I can't remember what I brought to the class. I also can't remember what I took away from it. I think, wow, now that I'm thinking about that moment in my life, it feels like an entirely different life. I'm sure that whatever I would bring to a clothing swap in class these days, I would remember, and I would also treasure anything that I take away with me from that clothing swap. But I'm also wondering if maybe that kind of careless energy was not just what I brought into that specific clothing swap classroom activity, but what many of us did. I don't know. So I guess there's, another thing to say there when it comes to what's the motivation. How can we get students interested and passionate about this? Going back to what Serena said earlier. In general, I hope I have shared some good strategies for inside the classroom, outside the classroom, when it comes to back to school, back to fashion school. I hope you can take away something from this, apply some of these strategies in this academic year, whether as a fashion student, as an educator, as a passerby. If you've listened to this podcast, you probably know that I like to end every podcast episode with 3 little things that we can do to redress fashion as a sort of recap of the ideas discussed. I think there are too many amazing pieces in this podcast episode, so it's hard to choose. But what I can think of is maybe first, question everything, from the definitions of fashion to why we wear what we wear and pretty much everything in between. The second one I would say is go beyond the basics or the tradition and include alternative practices, alternative perspectives, views, even bring your very own garments as pieces of fashion history into the classroom to highlight, among others, the stories of fashion that aren't usually classified as capital F fashion, as Katie put it. And finally, make things personal. Return to why things excite us or matter to us, whether it's at a very personal level or at the broader social, political, economic kind of activist levels. With that, I think that's it for today. I will leave the links and further readings and resources in the show notes for you if you want them. And if you have any feedback, please reach out to me via email or social media. I love engaging in conversation with you, and I would love to hear what you think, how you are applying these strategies, if you have any more thoughts that could potentially contribute to this matter. As always, thank you for tuning in, and until next time. See you soon.